In the smoky, clattering workshops of Birmingham in the late 19th century, a legend was being forged from cold steel and Victorian ambition. The British Empire was at its zenith, a sprawling colossus that painted the map red from Canada to Calcutta, and it required a sidearm that embodied its own brutish, unshakable confidence. The answer was the Webley Revolver, a weapon that would become as synonymous with the British officer class as the Sam Browne belt and the stiff upper lip. It was not a weapon of finesse, it was a bludgeon of industrial might, a top-break beast designed to put down a charging enemy with a single, massive blow. The story of the Webley is the story of the Empire's final, bloody crescendo, a narrative written in cordite smoke and the heavy thud of .455 caliber lead. To understand the Webley, one must first understand the philosophy of the Manstopper. In the frontier wars of the late 1800s, British officers often found themselves facing fanatical warriors who, fueled by adrenaline or narcotics, could absorb multiple hits from smaller caliber weapons and still close the distance to deliver a fatal sword blow. The delicate .36 caliber revolvers of the mid-century were deemed insufficient for the grim realities of colonial warfare. The British Army demanded something with bone-crushing mass. They turned to P. Webley & Son, a firm that understood that in the heat of a melee, reliability and stopping power were the only currencies that mattered. The result was a series of revolvers that felt less like machines and more like handheld artillery pieces. When you held a Webley, you felt the weight of the Industrial Revolution in your palm. It was top-heavy, solid, and utterly reassuring. The adoption of the Webley Mk I in 1887 marked a paradigm shift in military sidearms. Unlike the solid-frame Colt revolvers popular in the American West, which required a slow, tedious process of ejecting spent casings one by one, the Webley was a top-break design. With a press of a heavy latch on the side of the frame, the barrel and cylinder swung downward on a massive hinge. In a single, fluid motion, a star-shaped extractor rose from the center of the cylinder, catching the rims of the spent cartridges and lifting them out, scattering them onto the ground like brass confetti. This auto-ejection feature was revolutionary for a combat reload. In the panic of a Zulu charge or a dervish ambush, a trembling hand did not need to fiddle with an ejector rod. One simply broke the gun open, shook it, and dropped in 6 fresh rounds. It was a mechanism built for the terror of the moment. By the time the clouds of war gathered over South Africa in 1899, the Webley had evolved into the Mark IV, the so-called Boer War model. This was the conflict that would test the revolver in the crucible of modern warfare. The vast, dusty veldt of the Transvaal was a far cry from the parade grounds of Aldershot. Here, British officers learned hard lessons about the visibility of their uniforms and the lethality of Mauser rifles. But in the close-quarters scraps that often defined the later guerrilla phase of the war, the Webley proved its worth. The Boers were rugged, determined marksmen, and when the fighting devolved into a chaotic scramble and a rocky copy, the Webley's ruggedness shone. It was during this conflict that the Manstopper legend grew, although the ammunition itself was a subject of intense controversy. The Mk III cartridge, with its hollow-point Manstopper bullet, was devastatingly effective but was quickly withdrawn due to concerns it violated the Hague Convention. The British reverted to a flat-nosed solid-lead bullet, which, while technically compliant, still transferred energy with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The transition from the 19th to the 20th century saw the Webley evolve from a black powder weapon to one designed for the high pressures of cordite. This smokeless powder was more powerful, burning hotter and faster, necessitating stronger steel and tighter tolerances. The Webley Mk V was a transitional model, a beefed-up version of the Mark IV designed to handle this new propellant, but it was the Mk VI, introduced in 1915, that would become the icon. The Mk VI was the ultimate expression of the Webley design. Gone was the rounded bird's head grip of the earlier Victorian models, replaced by a square, utilitarian but that filled the hand. The barrel was 6 inches long, giving it a menacing silhouette, and the finish was a dull, non-reflective blue-black, suited for the grime of the trenches. This was the gun that would go over the top. World War I was a conflict of artillery and machine guns, a war where death was often impersonal and delivered from miles away. Yet, for the trench raider, the tunnel rat, and the officer leading a charge, the war was intimately, horrifyingly personal. In the mud-slicked labyrinths of the Western Front, long rifles were often a liability. They were unwieldy in the tight traverses of a trench, and their bolt actions were too slow for the frenzied brutality of hand-to-hand combat. This was the Webley's domain. Trench raids were nocturnal affairs, terrified men creeping through the jagged ruin of no man's land with blackened faces and improvised clubs. When a raid went loud, when the flares popped and the shadows came alive with German stormtroopers, the Webley barked its deep, throaty report. The heavy .455 bullet, moving at a leisurely 600 feet per second, was slow enough that some soldiers claimed they could see it in flight under the right light, but it hit with the force of a freight train. It did not just wound, it smashed bone and collapsed lungs, knocking a man backward into the mud. One of the most dramatic accounts of the Webley in action comes from the Battle of the Somme in 1916, involving the newly invented tank. Lieutenant Arthur Herbert Blowers commanded a Mark I tank named Dolphin. These early metal beasts were prone to mechanical failure and became magnets for German artillery. During an assault, Dolphin was disabled, trapped in the cratered hellscape of no man's land, and set ablaze. As the crew bailed out of the burning iron coffin, they were immediately set upon by German infantry. Blowers, wounded by shrapnel, did not surrender. He drew his Webley Mk VI. In the chaos that followed, the revolver was not just a symbol of rank, it was the difference between life and death. Blowers used his revolver to cover the retreat of his men, firing into the grey mass of the enemy, the auto-ejection allowing him to keep up a rate of fire that belied the weapon's archaic design. He managed to drag a wounded comrade back to British lines, his Webley empty and hot to the touch. For his valor, he was awarded the Military Cross, and his revolver remains a testament to the ferocity of that day, preserved in the Bovington Tank Museum. The Webley was not just a tool for killing, it was a psychological anchor for the men who carried it. In the terrifying isolation of a shell hole, with the world exploding around them, the weight of the revolver on a lanyard was a reminder of agency. A man with a rifle might jam it with mud, a man with a jam-prone automatic might fumble the magazine, but the Webley was loose. Its tolerances were generous by design. A bit of Flanders mud or Mesopotamian sand did not stop the cylinder from turning. It was a tractor of a gun, chugging along when finer machines seized up. This reliability endeared it to the men of the Royal Flying Corps as well. Early aviators, flying canvas-on-wood biplanes, carried Webleys not just for survival if they crashed behind enemy lines, but for aerial combat before machine guns were synchronized to fire through propellers. There were instances of pilots leaning out of their cockpits, freezing wind tearing at their goggles, taking potshots at enemy planes with their service revolvers, a futile, chivalric gesture that underscored the madness of the era. Between the wars, the Webley served as the policeman of the empire. From the Khyber Pass to the streets of Dublin, the silhouette of the Mk VI was a symbol of British authority. In Ireland, during the War of Independence, the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries carried Webleys as they patrolled the hostile lanes of County Cork. It was a dark chapter, a dirty war of ambushes and assassinations, and the Webley was often the instrument of summary justice and desperate defense. In India, it remained the sidearm of the British officer ensuring the peace of the Raj. It was during this interwar period that the Webley became inextricably linked with the romantic, if fading, image of the colonial adventurer. T. E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, though famous for his affection for the Mauser C-96, was also known to carry Webleys during his campaigns in the desert. The gun's resistance to sand made it ideal for the harsh conditions of the Arab Revolt. As the world darkened again in 1939, the Webley Mk VI was technically obsolete. The British Army, in a move that baffled many old soldiers, had decided to replace the heavy .455 caliber with a lighter .38/200 cartridge, fired from the Enfield No. 2 revolver. The logic was that the lighter weapon was easier to teach recruits to shoot, and that a .38 bullet tumbling through flesh was just as lethal as a heavy .455 slug. The veterans scoffed. They wanted the Manstopper. Consequently, when World War II broke out, the Webley Mk VI was not discarded. It was pulled from armories, dusted off, and issued to the Home Guard, to tank crews, and to officers who preferred the comforting heft of the old warhorse. The Webley saw service on the beaches of Dunkirk, where desperate officers used them to maintain discipline in the queues for the little ships or to fire a final defiant shot at the strafing Stukas. It saw action in the steaming jungles of Burma, where the fight against the Japanese was often at point-blank range. General William Bill Slim, the commander of the 14th Army and arguably Britain's finest general of the war, carried a Webley. In the green hell of the jungle, where dampness rotted leather and rusted steel overnight, the Webley's rugged simplicity was once again its greatest asset. There are stories of Chindits, the special operations forces operating deep behind Japanese lines, prizing the Webley for its ability to function after being submerged in river crossings. In the hands of a Gurkha or a British Tommy, the old Victorian cannon was still a fearsome weapon. One specific event in the Pacific theater highlights the Webley's enduring role. During the fall of Singapore in 1942, as the Japanese Imperial Army swept down the Malay Peninsula, British and Australian troops fought a series of desperate rearguard actions. In the confused, close-quarter fighting in the rubber plantations, the Webley was often the last line of defense. There are accounts of officers emptying their revolvers at charging Japanese infantry before being overrun. The Webley did not have the capacity of the American 1911 or the modern ergonomics of the German P-38, but it had a gravitas that those weapons lacked. When you fired a Webley, the recoil rocked your arm back, a physical reminder of the power you were unleashing. It was a weapon that demanded a firm hand and a steady nerve. Technically, the experience of firing a Webley Mk VI with full-power service ammunition is distinct. The double-action trigger pull is heavy and long, requiring a deliberate squeeze that rotates the massive cylinder before the hammer falls. However, the single-action pull cocking the hammer back with the thumb first is surprisingly crisp and light. This duality allowed the Webley to be used for aimed fire at distance, or rapid, suppressive fire at close range. The sights were primitive, a simple blade front and a U-notch rear, often part of the top strap latch itself. They were not designed for target shooting, they were designed for pointing at the center of mass of a human being at 10 yards. The grip, with its lanyard ring rattling at the bottom, was designed for a one-handed hold, the standard stance of the British officer. Two-handed grips were considered
ungentlemanly and unnecessary in the era of its design.
The legacy of the Webley is also tied to the tragic fate of many of these revolvers after the wars. In the post-war years, thousands of Mk VIs were sold as surplus to the United States.
However, the .455 Webley ammunition was scarce in America.
To make the guns marketable, importers performed a shave on the cylinder, machining a few millimeters off the rear face of the cylinder to allow the use of the ubiquitous .45 ACP cartridge in half-moon clips. While this allowed the guns to be fired with cheap ammo, it was a metallurgical disaster. The .45 ACP operates at significantly higher pressures than the old .455 Webley black powder or low-pressure cordite loads. Firing modern hardball .45 ACP through a shaved Webley is a game of Russian roulette. The top strap latch can stretch, the cylinder can burst, and the gun can effectively shake itself to pieces.
For collectors today, finding an unshaved Mk VI in its original
.455 caliber is a quest for the Holy Grail, a pursuit of a pristine piece of history that has not been butchered for the sake of convenience. The Webley also occupies a unique space in the cultural imagination. It is the gun of Dr. Watson in the Sherlock Holmes adaptations, the trusty sidearm of the loyal companion. It is the gun of Indiana Jones, who used both a Webley Green and a Mk7 in the films, symbolizing the rugged adventurer. But beyond fiction, it represents a specific moment in history, the sunset of the British Empire. It was the gun that presided over the height of imperial power and was there when the sun finally began to set. It fought in the mud of Passchendaele, the sands of North Africa, and the jungles of Southeast Asia. It was carried by heroes and cowards, by tactical geniuses and incompetent aristocrats. In the final analysis, the Webley Revolver was a triumph of function over form. It was never a beautiful weapon in the way a Luger is beautiful. It had the aesthetic of a steam locomotive. It was blocky, angular, and protruded with latches and screws. But its beauty lay in its honesty. It did exactly what it was designed to do. It opened quickly, it ejected reliably, and it threw a massive piece of lead that stopped the enemy in their tracks. It was a mechanical bulldog, stubborn, strong, and undeniably British. When one looks at a Webley today, resting in a museum case or a private collection, one does not just see a gun. One sees the phantom of a British officer in a trench coat, whistle in his mouth, Webley in his hand, climbing a wooden ladder into the grey dawn of 1916, ready to walk into the fire. It is a relic of a time when war was a test of industrial might and personal courage, and the Webley was the iron handshake that connected the two. The sound of a Webley being opened. That distinct, metallic clack clack as the barrel tips, the extractor snaps up and then snaps back down, is a sound that echoes through history. It is the sound of the colonial police station in 1920s Shanghai. It is the sound of the officers' mess in 1940s Cairo. It is a sound that signifies readiness. Even the loading of the weapon had a rhythm to it. The dropping of the fat, rimmed cartridges into the chambers, the heavy snap of the barrel swinging back up and locking into place with a vault-like solidity. There was no slide to rack, no safety to fumble with. The safety was the heavy double-action trigger pull. It was a weapon for men who expected to be in harm's way and needed a tool that would not fail them when the world turned violent. There is a poignant irony in the Webley's service life. It was designed for an era of colonial policing, to stop a single charging warrior, yet it found its greatest fame in the industrial slaughter of the world wars, where the individual was often insignificant. In the face of machine gun fire that could cut down a battalion in minutes, the Webley seems almost quaint. And yet, for the individual soldier trapped in a crater, that heavy revolver was the only thing that mattered. It was a personal protector in an impersonal war. The stories of men like Lieutenant Blowers prove that even in the age of the tank and the airplane, the courage of a man with a revolver could still turn the tide of a local skirmish. The ammunition itself deserves a final nod. The .455 Webley cartridge is a stubby, unassuming round. It does not look aerodynamic, it looks like a flying thumb, but its ballistics were terrifyingly effective for their purpose. It did not rely on velocity and hydrostatic shock like modern high-velocity rounds. It relied on momentum. It was a battering ram. When it hit a target, it dumped all its energy instantly. There were no through-and-through shots that left an enemy standing. If you were hit by a Webley, you stayed hit. This concept of stopping power has been debated by ballisticians for a century, but for the soldiers who used it, there was no debate. They trusted the Webley because they saw what it did. Today, the Webley is a collector's piece, a mechanical curiosity from a bygone age. But to hold one is to shake hands with history. The bluing may be worn to a silver patina, the grips may be chipped, and the bore may be dark with the residue of 1,000 rounds of cordite, but the spirit of the weapon remains. It stands as a testament to British engineering, overbuilt, slightly eccentric, but indomitable. It is the sidearm of an empire that has vanished, but the steel remains, silent and heavy, remembering the mud, the sand, and the glory of the past.